Okay, so Matthew, it's great to have you on this podcasting software. For the listeners' interest, I met Matthew about 5 years ago through my ValueX conference, and we've just spent about an hour talking about a company that's in my portfolio that is not in Matthew's portfolio. We've had a lot of fun analyzing what the company looks like in and beyond the coronavirus panic. So I just wanted to spend 10 to 15 minutes asking Matthew some questions in a certain way on the record. But Matthew, why don't you just introduce yourself briefly for the people who don't know you?
My name's Matthew Peterson, and I've been running Peterson Capital Management for 9 years. Spent some time out on Wall Street before that doing risk management work. And our portfolio is a concentrated long-term portfolio. We have somewhat unusual technique of oftentimes using short puts as a tool to own the equity.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And so part of why I wanted to get Matthew on the record for this is that I think, Matthew, that you have an extraordinary manner when it comes to talking to all sorts of people, including me. But you told me that you were calling up a lot of your investors and some people who've not yet invested with you. And you had a very particular message that you were sharing. And I was wondering if you could tell me on the record, so to speak, what you've been doing there and maybe teach me and potentially anyone else who listens to this.
Yeah, certainly. I don't think what I'm doing is novel in any particular way other than the fact that it's rare for me to do active outreach. It's not something that I usually doing on a daily, weekly, or even monthly basis. But I do believe that we are in an unprecedented time. And I think a lot of people are looking for some sort of compass. And I believe it's part of our fiduciary responsibility to help these people. So there are folks who are in my sort of extended network that I maybe had lunch with a few years ago or was introduced to through some sort of network. And yeah, I've spent a few hours each day reaching out to these contacts, people that have been reading my letters for years, to sort of let them know my view on things. And my view tends to be, in general, that this too shall pass, and we are in a situation where we have really confused markets, a lot of uncertainty, and that leads to advantageous pricing. And I don't want people who have been watching or been interested for years to miss this opportunity.
Yeah, so it is part of what you're doing, Matthew, in a certain sense, regret minimization. You'd hate to meet those people in a year or 2 or 5 years' time and for them to say, well, if you would have told me, I might have invested, but you never told me, so I didn't invest.
Yes, certainly. I suppose that's a part of it. There's a few ways to look at it. I think certainly I want to minimize that regret. It's also an unbelievable time for us to put capital to work. I have a huge list of companies now that have fallen into our buy zone. And the more cash that we have, the more we can take advantage of it. That helps all partners. And then the third aspect is that I do really believe that maybe I'm not changing everyone's life here, but if there's somebody who's a little confused or focused on their business and they get a little nudge from someone saying, hey, you might want to buy something in the equity markets, maybe they even just buy something in their own portfolio, but hopefully it helps them out a little bit.
And Matthew, so you told me earlier that you now don't feel comfortable unless you've done at least 2 or 3 of these calls a day. What kind of responses have you been getting?
The responses have been surprisingly positive. In fact, part of that is circumstantial. I think people are sitting around at home, and when their phone rings, they sort of pick up and answer. And I have at least somewhat interesting message for them. So we've raised a little capital through these calls, so it's actually been productive. But more so, it's been a meaningful way to reconnect with a lot of old contacts. And a lot of the conversations have turned into multiple conversations. In some cases, we spent maybe a couple hours on calls together, sort of walking through things. And I think people find it very valuable.
Yeah, well, that's great. So Matthew, in the event that there's somebody listening to this conversation, and even if they don't know you, they'd like to have that conversation with you, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
The best way is going to be to email me. So matthew.peterson@petersonfunds.com. And anybody can go to our website, petersonfunds.com, and look at all sorts of data. We've released our annual letter, our quarterly letter. There's a lot of media appearances that are there. reach out to me. I'd be happy to have a conversation.
It's worth saying that some time ago I produced a document called With Whom I Would Invest. And Matthew features there. I think that if I wasn't investing money myself and I had some other pursuit in life, I'd be very comfortable having a portion of my money invested with Matthew for all sorts of reasons. It's as much, Matthew, for your interest, your personality, and your capacity to create and sustain long-term relationships. You're a decent guy, as it is any kind of specific brilliance. As Warren Buffett has said, if the guy is not decent and honest, being really smart can be a danger. So the first thing is to make sure that the person's decent and straightforward and honest, and you are that in spades. So I'm just going to ask you a few more questions just for fun, really. I think it's a question that any investor or investment manager should be asking of every person that he meets. So I wanted you to come up with anywhere, 3 would be great, but even 1 is enough. Managers of corporations, ideally publicly traded, but they don't have to be, that you admire.
That's a great question. They don't have to be publicly traded. Well, I'll start with an obvious one, which is Charlie Munger, who I think is exceptional on so many levels. And I think it's not so much the management of Berkshire, but it's the other enterprises that are so valuable. For example, he runs a company called Daily Journal. Some folks who are very involved in finance will be familiar, but for many others, it's completely outside of their radar. It's a basically $300 million market cap company. And the things that they have done with this business that started as a small newspaper and is now running a SaaS model for government courthouses around the world is just extraordinary. The way that they have transformed this business and continued to grow this business, it's something truly exceptional. I think we'll be seeing those rewards many, many years after Charlie's gone. So Charlie certainly fits the mold. I'm constantly impressed with John Malone as well. John Malone uses more debt than I would like, but he is just a brilliant individual who has created this web of businesses, and many of them seem to be very attractive at times. The business models are great. It's quite confusing at times why they would have so many tracking stocks and those sorts of things. But I do think that John Malone is exceptional. And since you said it, they don't have to be public, I would say Peter Kaufman at Glenair is also exceptional. It's a private company, but he's managed to compound their book value at rates that completely blow away the market. They've been in a good business, but he is just a brilliant mind. Also close with Charlie Munger and a few others.
Thank you, Matthew. And you've actually had the extraordinary opportunity to have some personal interactions with Peter Kaufman, who's kind of legendary in Berkshire circles. I don't know if you can share how you managed to have those interactions and what you specifically learned from them that we might not learn from just reading the publicly available information on Peter Kaufman. And maybe you can just give a little more background on his relationship to Charlie Munger, his relationship to you and other value investors.
Sure, certainly. Peter Kaufman is quite a wise individual. He's relatively young, especially against Munger. I think he's in his 60s. And I believe the story is that he and Munger were introduced through philanthropic activities a couple of decades ago and have now spent an enormous amount of time together. I think they are together on a regular basis. And then, of course, he's the author of Poor Charlie's Almanac, or editor of the content within Poor Charlie's Almanac. So they have a very strong bond. He's also on the board of Daily Journal Co. So they have both a business relationship and a philanthropic relationship and a very friendly relationship. So they collaborate on things, share ideas. He has a series of mental models that I think are very impactful. I've learned a number of invariant strategies through him and just watched him put it in practice. So we were introduced a few years ago. I have recently moved from LA to Austin. And in LA, where Glenair is based, several fund managers were involved with him. We also have a position in Daily Journal, and he's a board member. And so we've been able to sit down through a number of different organizations over the last couple of years and have a few great conversations. I've learned a lot from Peter Kaufman, in fact.
It's interesting because he's a guy that I don't think will write a book, but there's 1 or 2 things that are circulating in private hands in various people's email inboxes. And I just remember one of them that I read, which involved you kind of like making sure that every one of your employees feels safe. You're not going to get the best performance out of your employees until they really know that they're safe. And he actually uses, I believe, an analogy with dogs and how you make a dog perform for you. And one of the first things you have to do is make sure that the dog feels safe. Are you aware of some of those publications?
Yeah, very much so. I used to think I had almost collected them all, and I found out that I think there's 100 of them or so.
That's another reason to be in touch with Matthew, because Matthew, you certainly have more of them kicking around your email inbox than I do, I believe, because you've had personal contact with Peter that I have not had. So moving on to one last question. So just a couple of books that you think would be helpful to anybody who happens to tune into this conversation, books that you're happy to share that maybe other people haven't read.
Yeah, certainly. One of the more obvious books that I think adds tremendous value to the investment process is Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits by Phil Fisher. There might be a lot of hedge fund managers that have gone through that and understand the scuttlebutt method and how to look at firms from this lens, but I don't know if there's quite as many people in the general audience who have read that book. And I also recently, I guess it's a couple of years old now, but Ed Thorpe's book, A Man for All Markets, I've now read it twice and listened to it on audiobook because it's actually just such an enjoyable read. Ed Thorpe is brilliant, ran a hedge fund that was extraordinarily successful, but also spent a lot of his life doing all sorts of creative things with his math skills, like going to Vegas and beating blackjack and then creating the first wearable computer and using it to predict where the ball is going to drop in roulette. And everywhere he went, he made a lot of money. It's a fun book to read.
It's amazing. That's a book that I have not read, so I'm going to have to go take a closer look at that. And Matthew, we've already shared how people get in touch with you if they want to audition for one of those calls, that now's the time to invest. If somebody just wants to follow you, they don't necessarily want to invest with you or they don't have enough money to invest with you, what's the best way to sort of be aware of what Matthew's up to? Is it your LinkedIn profile? Is there a Twitter profile? Is it your Facebook page?
Certainly, we can connect on LinkedIn, although that tends to be a pretty passive way to have a relationship. I think the best way would be to go to my website, petersonfunds.com, and sign up for the email distribution, and we'll start being in contact at least quarterly, and shoot me an email with any questions. I'm happy to talk.
Yeah, and Matthew, any last words for the audience?
I don't need to timestamp this necessarily, but here we are in the height of this crisis, and it's truly an extraordinary world we're living in. The whole world's in lockdown. I think the more people can stay calm and rational and understand that despite all the troubles, there's some real opportunity in the market, the better off they'll be in the long run.
Yeah, and I just end with saying that life is better with Matthew Peterson in it than with Matthew Peterson not in it. And so if you can find a way to have Matthew Peterson in your life, that's a good thing. Thanks for trying this out with me, Matthew.
Yeah, well, the feeling's mutual, guys, so appreciate that. Absolutely. It was a pleasure.